Thanks, Spencer. So yeah, if we go straight into the first slide, please. Okay, so just going to give a project overview and then get into the results of the questionnaire. So the objective of the project is to provide detailed guidance to English local authorities on how to open up, share and exploit their transport data. And we're looking at three key areas, which are traffic management, so the kind of traditional data you might think of, parking, which John was talking in depth about previously, and then data related to the future of transport agenda. And the really key part is that it must be truly user-centred. So if you just move on one, please. So we have Claire Williams, who's a human factors expert on the team, and this is a COM-B model, it's called, which just shows how people's behaviour is affected. So in order for someone to change their behaviour, they need to have the capability, the opportunity and the motivation. So if, for example, the behaviour is opening and sharing data, the capability might include having the technical skills to know what to do. The opportunity means the time and resources to do it. And the motivation is understanding how opening and sharing data is going to help them in their day job. So why would they want to share their data? So on to the next slide. Okay, so the scope of the project, we have pretty much finished the first task, which was led by Andy Graham, which is evidence review of the current data landscape. So we produced a local authority questionnaire, which some of you have probably filled in. We also held discussions with subnational transport bodies and future transport zones to get their perspectives on data sharing, and finally held discussions with third-party suppliers who might help authorities or provide data that might be shared. And then the next stage that we're just moving into, as I mentioned, Claire Williams is leading, and this is on the user requirements and pain points for the guidance. So we'll be holding interviews and workshops with local authorities, and because the end users of the guidance are also really important, the guidance needs to work for end users. So we will also have a workshop with end users to understand their requirements and pain points, and those things will feed into basically a specification for the guidance. In parallel with that, we're going to be reviewing potential operational benefits of sharing data and new business models for sharing data. And again, this comes back to helping understand why it's useful for people to share their data. The guidance can provide some information about benefits and business models. And then the final stage will be taking all of that knowledge and turning it into guidance, which we will do in accordance with the requirements spec and in partnership with local authorities at every stage. So we have Oxfordshire County Council on our team helping us, but we also want to engage with a really wide range of local authorities. And the guidance also needs to cover the end-to-end process, which is shown in this diagram, just from identifying a need or a capability all the way through to sharing the data and archiving it. So the next slide. Okay, so this is getting on to the results basically from the questionnaire that we issued a few weeks ago. So we had 61 responses from 49 local authorities in the end, which I think is a really good response rate. And that included 14 London boroughs. And 42% of the respondents said they were responsible for the data sharing, i.e. they do it, and 62% were accountable, as it's their job to make sure it's done. So obviously there was some people who are both. And then the graph shows the how people's data capabilities, I guess. And it's interesting that nearly half of respondents said that each team in the local authority is responsible for their own data and analytics, but a quarter said they have a dedicated data team in the local authority. So this is becoming more common. Okay, next slide. So this is getting into the details. So these were some types of data that we asked people about, and the red and orange shades mean that the local authority doesn't generate or own the data, or that they have it, but it's closed, it's not shared. Whereas the green it shows various levels of sharing the data. And this is across all of the authorities. You can see that the roadworks data is most often shared. It's the most commonly shared data type, followed by electric vehicle charging locations and geographical data, and then next network performance of journey times and flows. So the next slide shows the results for the London boroughs. And here the roadworks are even more likely to be shared. So a real majority of respondents said that they share their data, their roadworks data, from local authorities in London, and a lot of electric vehicle charging information compared to the wider local authorities as well, which is interesting. Whereas traffic management data and parking data are actually less likely to be shared by London boroughs. Okay, and then the next slide. So this is just looking at active travel, and this is back to all local authorities, and it shows actually a lot of authorities don't generate or own active travel data, and that's probably not surprising as it's relatively new, innovative type of data. However, and again, probably the same reason, where it does exist, it seems to be more likely that it's being shared. And again, that's perhaps because being innovative, it's kind of more likely to be considered something that it should be shared and it's important. Okay, next slide. So this is the last one, and it just shows other types of data, and emissions data of all these other types is most likely to be shared, whereas freight, licensing, and so that's things like taxis, and sentiment analysis least likely to be owned or generated. Okay, on to the next slide. So I'll skip through some of these. These are more details about what people are doing. So quite high levels of local authorities receiving data from third parties. The next slide. Okay, so UTMC, not surprisingly, the most commonly used data standard, and then followed by ANPR and NAPTAN. And then the next slide is around data sharing, and interestingly, and probably not surprisingly, it's most common to share data with other public sector organisations, and then onto the sort of public services type thing, and finally third party private sector. Okay, next slide. This was interesting. So there's the methods used to share data are fairly traditional for the majority, so things like email and that kind of thing, spreadsheets, but a quarter do mention open data website, XML, APIs, that sort of thing. Okay, and the next slide. And then in terms of file formats, again, the most common formats are fairly traditional, so spreadsheets and PDFs, that kind of thing. Okay, and then the next slide, that is all the main findings about how authorities currently share their data. So then we're also looking at what the benefits are of sharing data, and we've identified and will be continuing to research this. So this is where we'd like some input if possible. So we know that there are benefits from just authorities internally sharing data with other departments, basically. So sharing traffic data with asset management or health departments, we can see benefits from that. And then data analytics, so things like predictive modelling, using data to do multimodal models, that kind of thing. We know that there's potential there, and we've also heard about people sharing data with emergency services. So, for example, the police to support enforcement activities during COVID, people speeding, and then there's also some business models that we are considering, and this is really useful because it will help explain, as I said, why it's really beneficial to share data. So if you just move on one, just a question really, if anybody can think of other operational benefits that we haven't thought of already, if you could type it into the chat pane, that would be really useful, thank you. And meanwhile, I shall move on to the next slide, if that's okay. So this is the pain points, and again, this was across all the local authorities, and a lot of this was ones that we identified and asked people whether it was an issue for them, and you can see that there's generally quite high volumes of people agreeing with various pain points that we'd identified. So that's good because it gives us confidence that we have identified sort of the right challenges that the guidance needs to address. And then the next slide just shows the results specifically for the London boroughs. And this is interesting because it appears that access to data and complexities around data ownership are more often mentioned by the London boroughs, whereas things like a shortage of technical skills and the benefits of sharing data not being obvious are less often mentioned. So there is a difference there. And if you just move on, so this is the next favour that I've got to ask, which is if there's any pain points that aren't on this list, aren't on this graph, that you think we should be aware of and should be using the guidance to address, again, please put a note in the chat pane. Okay, so just to summarise, 30% of the respondents share various types of data in some way, but that does mean that quite a few don't. And active travel data is less often owned, but those that do have it are more likely to share it, appears. The methods of data sharing can be quite traditional, which was interesting. And lots of agreement around the pain points that we identified, which means we're hopefully got a good understanding of that. So on to the next slide. Just to go back on the next steps, which are to hold the interviews with local authorities and I'll analyse the benefits and business models, and then development of the guidance. And if you just move on one, so we don't want to prejudge what the guidance should contain, because working with local authorities, this is where we want to understand what people actually need rather than make assumptions about what they need. But what we do know is it will be how-to guides which will address the capability. So just going back to the COM-B model that I showed before, case studies will help with the motivation to help understand what's worked well. And then things like business case advice will potentially help address the opportunity issues where if it helps people get funding to do more work. And the next slide. And that's it from me, with just another final favour to ask, please, which is any local authority who is interested in helping us, working with us in these workshops and going forward in developing the guidance, again, please either contact me on the email address or put your details in the chat pane. That would be really helpful. Thank you. Cheers.